The night my daughter-in-law introduced me as the help to her important dinner guests, nobody saw the shock on my face. I simply nodded, filled their wine glasses, and continued serving the meal I had prepared in my own kitchen. I didn't say a word about being the actual owner of the $8 million estate they were so openly admiring, at least not until the perfect moment. When Richard married Eleanor 3 years ago, I was overjoyed. My only son had found someone he loved, someone ambitious and driven. They made a striking couple, him with his father's warm eyes and my business sense. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her with her polished appearance and social connections. I welcomed Eleanor with open arms, giving them the east wing of my home as a wedding present until they could find a place of their own. It wasn't that I needed company in this sprawling house. After losing Thomas to cancer 5 years earlier, I'd grown accustomed to the quiet. But there was something comforting about hearing their voices echo through the halls, about setting 3 places at the dinner table instead of 1. Besides, the property had been in my family for generations. I'd rescued it from near foreclosure when I was just 28, working 80-hour weeks to restore it to its former glory. Every chandelier, every hardwood floor, every rose in the garden had been personally selected or tended by me. This wasn't just a house, it was my life's work. At first, Eleanor seemed grateful. She would bring me coffee in the mornings, ask for advice about her career in marketing. "I'm so lucky to have you as a mother-in-law, Victoria," she'd say, admiring the antique vase I'd placed in their sitting room. "You have such impeccable taste." But something shifted after her promotion. Suddenly, my home was outdated. The furniture I'd carefully collected over decades was quaint. Eleanor began redecorating, first their wing, then suggesting changes to the main areas. "You really should update the kitchen, Victoria. Those cabinets are so vintage." I didn't mind accommodating some changes. After all, this was their home too now. But somewhere along the line, accommodation became expectation. Eleanor would invite colleagues over without telling me, then ask if I could whip up something special for them. Richard, always eager to support his wife's career advancement, would smile apologetically but say nothing in my defense. "Mom's the best cook in Massachusetts," he'd say, as if that explained why I should drop everything to prepare gourmet meals for Eleanor's impromptu gatherings. I began to notice how Eleanor introduced me to her friends. "This is Victoria, Richard's mother," she'd say, with a tone that made it clear this was my only relevant identity. "Never, Victoria Williams, the woman who built Williams' architectural restoration from nothing. Never, Victoria, who preserved over 30 historic buildings in this city. Just Richard's mother, who happened to cook well and lived in this lovely old house." Last month, Eleanor announced she'd invited the entire executive team from her company for a formal dinner. "It's crucial for my vice presidency bid," she explained, not really asking so much as informing me. "We'll need the formal dining room, of course, and I was thinking your roasted duck with cherry sauce would really impress them." I agreed, as I always did. I spent 3 days preparing, polishing the silver that had been in my family for 4 generations, arranging flowers from my garden, and crafting a menu that would showcase the best local seasonal ingredients. The morning of the dinner, I was up at dawn baking fresh bread and setting the table with my finest linens. When Eleanor came downstairs, she frowned at my outfit. A simple but elegant black dress I'd worn to many business events over the years. "Victoria, I was thinking," she said carefully, eyeing my pearl necklace. "Since you'll be busy in the kitchen anyway, maybe you could wear something a bit more practical? The caterers are wearing black and white." I tilted my head. "What caterers?" "Oh, I hired staff to serve," she said dismissively. "You shouldn't have to handle everything. But since you'll be overseeing the food," I felt a strange tightness in my chest, but nodded. "Of course." Whatever makes the evening run smoother. By 7 o'clock, I had changed into a simple black skirt and white blouse, as requested. The caterers Eleanor had hired turned out to be 2 college students with no serving experience. I gently showed them how to present the appetizers, how to pour wine without dripping, how to clear plates between courses. They were grateful for the guidance, calling me ma'am with genuine respect. The guests began arriving at 7:30. 5 couples, all in designer clothes and subtle jewelry that spoke of real wealth rather than aspiration. Eleanor glided among them effortlessly, while Richard poured drinks at the bar cart I'd set, up in the corner. I remained in the kitchen, putting final touches on the first course until Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "Victoria, could you bring out the canapes? The servers are handling drinks." Her tone was pleasant, but held that edge I'd come to recognize, the one that assumed compliance. I carried the silver trays into the living room where the guests had gathered, admiring the original crown molding and marble fireplace that I'd spent a small fortune restoring. "The architectural details are exquisite," one man was saying. "You must have paid a premium for this level of craftsmanship." Eleanor beamed, accepting the compliment as if she'd installed every cornice herself. "We believe in preserving history while adding modern touches," she said, gesturing to the contemporary art pieces she'd hung, without asking, on my walls. As I offered the tray of appetizers, one woman smiled at me. "These look amazing." "Thank you," I said softly. "It's a family recipe." Eleanor quickly stepped forward. "Oh, Martha, this is Richard's mother. She's been kind enough to help with the cooking tonight." Another guest, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, nodded politely in my direction. "The help is so hard to find these days. You're fortunate to have family willing to step in." Before I could respond, Eleanor laughed lightly. "Yes, we're lucky. Victoria's just like family to the house staff. They all adore her." She touched my arm briefly. "Would you mind checking on the first course? I think we're ready to move to the dining room." I felt Richard's eyes on me from across the room, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. But he said nothing, just raised his glass in a silent toast that felt more like an apology. As I turned to head back to the kitchen, I heard Eleanor say, "She's practically our housekeeper at this point, but she loves it. Gives her purpose, at her age." I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, Eleanor's words ringing in my ears. Practically our housekeeper, at her age. The wooden spoon in my hand suddenly felt heavy. 62 wasn't ancient, despite what my daughter-in-law seemed to think. I'd been running my company until just last year when I'd stepped back to semi-retirement, a decision I was increasingly regretting. The catering students looked at me with sympathy. One of them, a young woman named Zoe, whispered, "Are you okay, Mrs. Williams?" I straightened my shoulders and gave her a tight smile. "Perfectly fine. Let's plate the first course." But I wasn't fine. For 3 years, I'd been slowly erased from my own home, my identity whittled down to Richard's mother, and now, apparently, the help. I thought of Thomas and what he would say if he could see how our son and his wife were treating me. Thomas had built this home with me, not just the business that paid for the renovations, but the actual restoration work. His hands had stripped and refinished the banisters they were so casually leaning against, while sipping the expensive wine I'd selected. As I arranged the delicate salad of heirloom tomatoes and burrata, ingredients I'd personally sourced from the farmer's market that morning, I wondered when exactly I had become invisible. Was it gradual, like water slowly eroding stone? Or had I simply allowed it, believing that supporting Richard meant accepting any treatment from his wife? When the salads were ready, Zoe and the other server, Michael, carried them out. I followed, with a basket of the freshly baked bread, moving quietly around the table, refilling water glasses. The conversation flowed around me as though I were truly invisible. "Eleanor tells me you're being considered for the international division," one of the women said, cutting into her salad without even a glance in my direction as I filled her water glass Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor nodded, patting her lips with my grandmother's linen napkins. Yes, it would mean overseeing our European expansion. Richard's firm is already looking at potential properties for us in London. Richard smiled, pride evident in his expression. Eleanor's perfect for the position. Nobody works harder. I couldn't help the small twinge in my chest. Richard had never spoken about my work with such open admiration, despite the fact that my restoration company had put him through the best private schools and universities. The commute would be brutal, another guest commented. Eleanor laughed, a practiced sound that never quite reached her eyes. Oh, we wouldn't commute. We'd relocate, of course. This place is lovely, but it's time for something that's truly ours. Truly theirs. As if this home, my home, was just a temporary stopping place. As if the blood, sweat, and tears I'd poured into these walls meant nothing. "What about your mother-in-law?" someone asked, finally acknowledging my existence, if not my presence. Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "Victoria would be fine. She could find a nice condo, something more manageable. This place is really too large for someone alone anyway." I nearly dropped the breadbasket. They were planning to move to London and expected me to sell my family home, the home that had been in my family for 4 generations, the home where I'd raised Richard, where Thomas and I had built our life together. Richard must have sensed my shock because he quickly added, "Nothing's decided yet. We're just exploring options." "Of course," Eleanor said smoothly. "We would never make such a decision without consulting Victoria. Family first, always." The way she said family made it clear I was peripheral to her definition of the word. I was not the family. I was the relation, the appendage, the elderly inconvenience. I excused myself to check on the main course, my hands trembling slightly as I pushed through the kitchen door. The duck was perfect, the skin crisp and golden, the sauce glossy and fragrant with cherries and port wine. I'd prepared this meal countless times for special occasions, including the night I told Thomas I was pregnant with Richard. Zoe helped me plate the dish, arranging the duck breast over wild rice with roasted vegetables. "This looks amazing," she said. "My mom would kill for this recipe." "It was my mother-in-law's," I replied, suddenly remembering Evelyn, Thomas's mother. She had welcomed me into this house with open arms when we first married, sharing family recipes and stories about each room. Never once had she made me feel like an intruder, despite my youth and inexperience. She taught me to cook when I first joined the family. "You must have been a quick learner," Michael said, eyeing the perfectly plated food. "I was motivated," I said, with a small smile. I wanted to belong. Watching the servers carry out my carefully prepared meal, I wondered if Eleanor felt the same need to prove herself. Perhaps her dismissiveness came from insecurity, from feeling she needed to claim this space as her own. But as I followed with the sauce boat, I heard her holding court at the head of the table, my place, where I had sat for 30 years beside Thomas. "The restoration was a nightmare," she was saying. "The previous owners had let it fall into terrible disrepair. Richard and I have put so much work into bringing it back to its original splendor." I nearly stumbled. Previous owners? I had never been a previous owner. This had been my home since before Richard was born. And the restoration? That had been my life's work, both professionally and personally. The silver-haired man nodded appreciatively. "The millwork is exceptional. You don't see craftsmanship like this anymore." "No, you don't," Eleanor agreed, as if she had any idea what went into preserving century-old woodwork. "We had to bring in specialists from Boston. I had been that specialist. I had personally sourced the period-appropriate materials, hired the craftsmen, overseen every detail. My company had been founded on exactly this kind of restoration work." Richard caught my eye as I poured sauce over his duck. There was a flicker of shame there, quickly masked with a tight smile. "Mom's duck is legendary," he said, attempting to give me some credit. "She's been making it for special occasions since I was a boy." "Victoria is quite the cook," Eleanor added smoothly. "Such a traditional skill. My mother was the same way, happiest when she was feeding everyone, as if that was all I was, a cook, a traditional woman with traditional skills. Not a businesswoman who had built an empire preserving architectural history. Not the owner of this home that they were so casually claiming as their own achievement." I finished serving and stepped back, watching them enjoy the fruits of my labor without a single word of thanks. In that moment, something inside me, something that had been bending for 3 long years, finally broke. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I served, I cleared, I brought out the dessert, a dark chocolate soufflé that had taken years to perfect. The guests murmured appreciatively with each course, complimenting Eleanor on her amazing dinner, while Richard occasionally attempted to redirect credit my way. But his weak deflections only emphasized how thoroughly I'd been relegated to the role of servant in my own home. After dessert, Eleanor suggested giving their guests a tour of the house. "You simply must see the library. The original shelving is exquisite. We've preserved all of it." I silently followed the group as they moved from room to room, listening as my daughter-in-law fabricated stories about renovations that had happened decades before she was born. "This chandelier was impossible to find," she said in the formal living room, gesturing to the antique crystal fixture that Thomas and I had discovered in a small shop in Vienna on our 20th anniversary. "We had it shipped from Europe." The teapiece, a marble fireplace that I'd spent months restoring by hand, was a lucky find under layers of paint. The hand-painted wallpaper in the dining room that had cost me a small fortune was described as a reproduction we commissioned. With each room, with each lie, I felt myself fading further into the background. I was becoming a ghost in my own life story. When they reached the library, Thomas's favorite room, with the built-in shelves he'd helped me restore, Eleanor turned to me with a practiced smile. "Victoria, would you mind bringing coffee to the sunroom? I think we'll end the tour there." It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal. I nodded and retreated to the kitchen, where I mechanically prepared a tray of coffee and petit fours. My movements were automatic, but my mind was racing. When had I become so passive? When had I started accepting this gradual erosion of my dignity? As I carried the heavy silver coffee service toward the sunroom, I passed the portrait gallery, a long hallway, lined with family photographs chronicling the Williams family history in this house. There was my great-grandfather, standing proudly on the front steps the day he purchased the property. My grandmother in the garden that I still maintained, my parents on their wedding day. Thomas and me, young and hopeful, on the day we took ownership. And there at the end of the hall was a photograph of Richard as a little boy, sitting on the library window seat with a book in his lap. The same window seat where Eleanor was now regaling her guests with tales of her renovations. Stopped in front of the photographs, really seeing them for the first time in years. 4 generations of my family had poured their hearts into this home. I had personally saved it when my parents could no longer afford its upkeep. Every inch of this house held memories that belonged to me, not to Eleanor, not even to Richard. This was my legacy, and I was allowing it to be stolen right before my eyes. Something shifted inside me. A quiet resolve hardened into determination. I continued to the sunroom, where Eleanor's guests were admiring the view of the gardens in the fading evening light. "The coffee service," I announced, setting down the heavy tray on the antique table. That had been my grandmother's. "Just leave it here, Victoria," Eleanor said without looking at me. "We can serve ourselves." I didn't move. Instead, I straightened up and looked around the room at the assembled guests. "I couldn't help overhearing your tour," I said, my voice stronger than it had been all evening. "I thought you might appreciate some additional historical context about the house." Eleanor's smile froze. That's not necessary. I'm sure everyone's heard enough about old houses for one evening. On the contrary, said the silver-haired man who had earlier commented on the craftsmanship. I'd love to hear more. You said your family has owned this property for how long? Eleanor hesitated. My husband's family has a long history here. 4 generations, I said firmly. My great-grandfather purchased this property in 1897. It was passed down through the family until it came to me. The guests looked between Eleanor and me, confusion evident on their faces. Victoria is being modest, Eleanor said with a tight laugh. She maintained the house before Richard and I took over its restoration. Maintained? I raised an eyebrow. That's an interesting way to describe it. I turned to the guests. I'm Victoria Williams, founder of Williams Architectural Restoration. My company has preserved over 40 historic properties in New England, including this one, which has been my personal residence for the past 35 years. The room fell silent. Eleanor's face had drained of color. In fact, I continued, moving toward the wall where a framed magazine cover hung. This house was featured in Architectural Digest 15 years ago after I completed the major restoration work. I tapped the frame, where a younger version of myself stood proudly on the front steps. That was quite an honor. One of the women leaned forward, squinting at the photo. That's you. I remember this issue. Your restoration work was groundbreaking. Thank ye. You, I said. It was a labor of love. Still is. Richard had gone very still, his eyes fixed on his shoes. Eleanor was attempting to maintain her composure, but I could see the panic rising in her expression. Victoria was being so helpful in the kitchen. We didn't want to bore everyone with technical details, she said weakly. Technical details? I laughed softly. Like how I personally hand-stripped the woodwork in the library? Or how I researched period-appropriate materials for every room? Or perhaps how I designed the garden renovation that you can see from these windows. The silver-haired man was looking at me with newfound respect. Williams Restoration? Your firm handled the Bradbury Mansion renovation in Providence. That was extraordinary work. I nodded. One of my favorite projects. I had no idea we were in the presence of such expertise, another guest said, clearly reassessing the dynamic they had witnessed all evening. Eleanor laughed nervously. Victoria is so modest about her accomplishments. We've always said she should talk more about her work, haven't we, Richard? Richard finally looked up, his expression a complex mixture of shame and surprise. I realized in that moment that he had never seen this side of me, the businesswoman, the expert, the authority. To him, I had always just been Mom, the supportive, background figure who made everything run smoothly. Actually, he said slowly, I don't think I've ever really acknowledged how incredible Mom's work is, or how much this house means to her. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. I was no longer invisible. For the first time all evening, people were looking directly at me, seeing me as a person of substance rather than as the help. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down in my favorite armchair. Now, if you have any questions about genuine historical restoration, I'd be happy to answer them. The next hour transformed the entire dynamic of the evening. The guests, initially awkward about the revelation, soon warmed to my expertise and began asking genuine questions about the house's history. I found myself pointing out details they had missed on Eleanor's rushed tour. The original brass hinges I'd sourced from a salvage yard in Maine, the hidden compartment in the library paneling, the story behind each architectural choice. Eleanor sat stiffly on the settee, her smile fixed and brittle. Richard hovered nearby, occasionally adding childhood memories of the renovation process, but mostly watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something between surprise and rediscovery. By the time the guests began making noises about leaving, the narrative of the evening had completely shifted. Business cards were exchanged, not with Eleanor, but with me. The silver-haired man, who turned out to be Jonathan Hargrove, chairman of a historical preservation society, expressed interest in consulting with me on an upcoming project. Your knowledge is exactly what we need, he said warmly. And to think we might have missed the opportunity to connect if you hadn't spoken up. As the guests filed out with handshakes and genuine thanks directed my way, Eleanor's composed facade began to crack. The moment the door closed behind the last couple, she turned to me, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "How could you?" she hissed. "You completely undermined me in front of my colleagues." I placed my empty coffee cup on the sideboard, with deliberate care. "Undermined you? By telling the truth about my own home? You made me look like a fool." Her voice rose slightly. "These people are crucial to my promotion." Richard stepped between us, his hands raised placatingly. "Let's all calm down. It was just a misunderstanding." I looked at my son, my kind, conflict-avoidant son who had always tried to smooth over difficult situations. But this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was years of erasure coming to a head. A misunderstanding? "Richard, your wife introduced me as the help," she claimed, credit for my life's work. She discussed selling my home as if I weren't standing right there serving her dinner. Which part of that is a misunderstanding? Richard's face fell. "Mom, Eleanor didn't mean it that way." "Actually," I said quietly, "I think she did. And I think you've allowed it, perhaps even encouraged it." Eleanor crossed her arms defensively. "You're blowing this out of proportion. I was simply trying to make conversation with my colleagues. You know how important this promotion is to me." "So important that you'd lie? That you'd diminish me in my own home?" I shook my head. "I've spent 3 years accommodating you both, stepping back, making room. I've cooked your meals, hosted. Your friends kept quiet when you redecorated spaces that held precious memories for me. And tonight, I realized that no matter how much I give, it will never be enough. I will always be just Richard's mother, just the cook, just the cleaning lady." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken truths. Richard looked stricken, as if really seeing the situation for the first time. "Mom, we never meant—" "Intentions don't matter as much as actions," I interrupted gently. "And your actions have made it clear where I stand in this household." I turned and began walking toward the main staircase, suddenly bone-tired. "Where are you going?" Eleanor called after me. "We need to resolve this." I paused, my hand on the banister, the same banister I had carefully restored decades ago. "I'm going to bed. It's been a long evening, and I have some thinking to do." "Thinking about what?" Richard asked, alarm creeping into his voice. I looked back at my son and his wife, standing in the foyer of my ancestral home, a home they had claimed as their own without a second thought. "About what happens next," I said simply, and continued up the stairs. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake in the master bedroom that had once been filled with Thomas's and my laughter, staring at the ceiling and replaying not just the dinner party, but the past 3 years. Each small slight, each moment when I'd bitten my tongue, each time I'd stepped back to make room for Eleanor's ambitions and Richard's marriage. I had done it all willingly, believing that's what mothers do. They sacrifice, they accommodate, they put their children's happiness above their own. But somewhere along the way, sacrifice had turned into erasure. Accommodation had become exploitation. Thomas would have never allowed it. I could almost hear his voice. "Vicky, don't let anyone make you small, not even our son." By morning, I had made my decision. I rose early, as was my habit, and prepared coffee. The house was quiet. Richard and Eleanor rarely emerged before 9 on weekends. I took my coffee to the garden, watching the early light play across the roses I had planted the year Richard was born. When I heard movement inside, I returned to the kitchen. Richard was there alone, looking haggard, as if he too had spent a sleepless night. He glanced up when I entered, his expression uncertain. "Mom, about last night." I held up a hand. "Before you say anything, I need you to listen." I set my coffee cup down and looked directly at my son. "I've made a decision. I think it's time for me to travel." His brow furrowed in confusion. "Travel? What do you mean?" "I mean that I'm going to take some time away from this house. I've always wanted to see Italy properly, not just the rush tour your father and I took when you were in college. I want to explore the architecture, the history, the food. I want to visit the places Thomas and I always talked about seeing together." "For how long?" Richard asked, his voice small, like the child he had once been. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "A few months at least." Richard's face fell. "But what about the house? What about us?" "The house will still be here when I return. As for you and Eleanor..." I sighed. "I think some distance would be good for all of us right now." "Mom, please," Richard began, looking genuinely distressed. "Last night was awful, but we can fix this. Eleanor feels terrible." I doubted that very much, but I didn't contradict him. "This isn't a punishment, Richard. It's a necessity. I've spent so long being defined by this house, by being your mother, by supporting everyone else's dreams. I've forgotten who I am outside of those roles. But we need you," he said, and in that moment, I could see both the man he had become and the boy he had been. "No," I said gently but firmly. "You want me, as long as I'm useful, as long as I stay in my place. That's not the same as needing." "Me." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, still in her silk pajamas, her face carefully composed. "Victoria, I want to apologize for last night. I was thoughtless, and I'm truly sorry." Her words seemed practiced, her tone calculated. This wasn't a genuine apology, it was damage control. "Thank you for saying that," I replied evenly. "I was just telling Richard that I'll be traveling for a while." Eleanor's eyes widened briefly before she masked her surprise. "Traveling? How unexpected." I could almost see the calculations running behind her eyes. What this meant for her dinner parties, for her household help, for her image as the lady of the manor. "Yes," I said, allowing myself a small smile. "Quite unexpected. But then, life often is." 2 weeks later, I stood in the grand foyer with my luggage packed, my passport in hand, and a sense of both trepidation and exhilaration fluttering in my chest. I'd booked a 3-month tour of Italy, beginning in Rome and meandering through Tuscany, Venice, and the Amalfi Coast. All the places Thomas and I had dreamed of exploring together someday. Richard and Eleanor had reacted differently to my announcement. Richard had been stunned, then pleading, and finally resigned. Eleanor had cycled through disbelief, calculated concern, and thinly veiled relief, though that relief had quickly soured when she realized the implications of my departure. "But who will handle the garden maintenance? And the cleaning service needs supervision," she'd protested when reality set in. "And what about Richard's birthday next month? You always make his favorite cake." I had smiled and handed her a neatly organized binder. "Here's everything you need. Contact information for all the household services, schedules for maintenance, even recipes for Richard's favorite meals. You're in charge now, Eleanor, just as you've wanted to be." The look on her face, a mixture of panic and resentment, had confirmed everything I needed to know about her readiness for the responsibility she'd so eagerly claimed. Now, as I waited for the car service to arrive, Richard came down the stairs, his expression somber. "You're really doing this," he said, not quite a question. "I am." I straightened my jacket, a new purchase, something elegant and modern that Eleanor would never have expected me to choose. "I still don't understand why it has to be so long. Couldn't you start with a week or 2? I shook my head. "This isn't a vacation, Richard. It's a reset." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father that my heart constricted momentarily. I know I've messed up, Mom. I should have said something at the dinner party. I should have said something a long time ago. Yes, I agreed simply. You should have. I got caught between you and Eleanor. I didn't want to upset either of you. And in trying to please everyone, you ended up enabling behavior that hurt me deeply. I reached out and straightened his collar, an old habit. But this isn't just about you or Eleanor or that dinner party. This is about me reclaiming myself. The doorbell rang, and Richard flinched. That's your car. I nodded, suddenly aware that this was really happening. I was leaving the home I had poured my heart into for decades. I was stepping away from my role as the ever-accommodating mother and household manager. Where's Eleanor? I asked, glancing around the quiet house. She had an early meeting, Richard said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. Of course she did. Eleanor had been conspicuously busy since my announcement, as if my departure were a minor inconvenience rather than a seismic shift in our family dynamic. Richard picked up my suitcases as I opened the door for the driver. The morning air was crisp with early autumn, my favorite season in New England, when the maples in the garden turned brilliant crimson and gold. As the driver loaded my luggage, Richard turned to me, his face suddenly young and vulnerable. What? If you find you like Italy so much you don't want to come back? The question revealed his real fear. Not that I would stay away too long, but that I might never return. That I might choose a new life over the one I had built here. I cupped his cheek, the way I had when he was small and needed reassurance. This is my home, Richard. I'm not abandoning it or you. I'm just giving us all some necessary space. He nodded, swallowing hard. I love you, Mom. I love you too. Always have. Always will. I hugged him tightly, then stepped back, squaring my shoulders. But loving you doesn't mean I have to disappear. Remember that while I'm gone. With those words, I climbed into the waiting car, my heart pounding with an exhilarating mixture of fear and freedom. As we pulled away, I didn't look back at the house. Instead, I looked forward, toward the horizon and whatever waited for me beyond it. The flight to Rome was long but surprisingly pleasant. For the first time in years, I had nothing to do but sit quietly with my own thoughts. No meals to prepare, no gardens to tend, no social calendar to manage. Just me, a good book, and the anticipation of adventure. I had booked a small but elegant hotel in the historic center of Rome, within walking distance of the Pantheon. My room overlooked a bustling piazza, filled with cafes and the rhythmic symphony of Italian life. That first evening, I sat at a small table outside a trattoria, savoring perfectly al dente pasta and watching the theater of daily life unfold around me. A young couple argued passionately at the next table, their hands flying in expressive gestures. An old man read his newspaper, undisturbed by the noise. Children chased pigeons across the cobblestones while their parents sipped espresso and chatted with neighbors. No one here knew me as Richard's mother or the lady of the Williams estate. I was simply a woman enjoying her dinner, invisible, in the most liberating way possible. I took out my phone and found myself composing an email to Zoe, the catering student who had been so kind on that fateful evening. I had hired her as a part-time assistant before leaving, asking her to keep an eye on things and report back occasionally. Not to spy, I wasn't interested in petty surveillance, but to ensure that the house I loved was being properly cared for. Made it to Rome, I wrote. The Pantheon is even more magnificent than I imagined. How are things at the house? Her reply came quickly, despite the time difference. Everything's quiet here. Mr. Williams asked me how to program the thermostat. Yesterday, Mrs. Williams tried to cancel the gardening service, but I showed her your note about the rose pruning schedule. The garden looks beautiful, The fall colors are just starting. Enjoy Rome, I smiled, picturing Eleanor confronting the realities of maintaining a historic home. Let her learn what just housekeeping actually entailed. Over the next few days, I fell into a rhythm that felt entirely my own. Mornings spent in museums and churches, studying architectural details that had once been merely professional interest, but now fed something deeper in my soul. Afternoons wandering narrow streets, discovering small shops and hidden courtyards. Evenings at different restaurants, sometimes exchanging pleasant conversation with fellow travelers, sometimes content in my solitude. By the end of the first week, I felt my shoulders relaxing, the tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying slowly dissolving. I stopped checking my phone constantly for messages from home. I started keeping a journal, something I hadn't done since college. In my second week, I met a group of American women on an architectural tour, all professionals, all around my age, all traveling without spouses or children. We connected immediately, over our shared interests, and soon I found myself joining their excursions, sharing meals and laughter, exchanging stories. "My husband died last year," said Margaret, a landscape architect from Chicago, as we shared a bottle of wine one evening. "My children kept trying to move me into a condo, sell the house, simplify my life, as if I wasn't capable of deciding what I wanted." The others nodded in understanding. "My daughter-in-law redecorated my kitchen while I was visiting my sister," said Catherine, a retired professor. "Said she was helping me update. I'd just renovated it the year before." "My son expected me to be a full-time babysitter for his kids," added Diane, a former lawyer. "When I said I could do 2 days a week, not 5, he accused me of not loving my grandchildren." As I listened to their stories, I realized with a jolt that what had happened to me wasn't unique or personal. It was a pattern. Children and their spouses assuming control, erasing the identities of their parents, particularly mothers, once they reached a certain age. "So, what did you all do?" I asked, curious about their solutions. They smiled, these strong, vibrant women who had refused to fade into the background. Margaret had kept her house and started a small landscape consulting business from her home office. Catherine had firmly reclaimed her kitchen and established clear boundaries with her daughter-in-law. Diane had created a schedule that honored both her grandmotherly duties and her own interests. They had all, in their own ways, stepped back, into the center of their own lives. "And you?" Margaret asked me. "What will you do when you go back?" It was a question I had been avoiding. But now, surrounded by these women who had faced similar crossroads, I found an answer forming. "I'm going to reclaim my home," I said firmly. "Not just the physical space, but my place in it. And if Richard and Eleanor can't adjust to that reality, they'll need to find somewhere else to live." The women raised their glasses in a toast. "To reclaiming our lives," Margaret said. "To visibility," added Catherine. "To being more than someone's mother, grandmother, or widow," Diane concluded. We clinked glasses, and in that moment, I felt a certainty and purpose that had been missing for far too long. The weeks in Italy stretched into a month, then 2. I moved from Rome to Florence, immersing myself in Renaissance architecture and art. I sketched buildings, something I hadn't done since my university days. I took cooking classes, learning to make pasta from scratch with an elderly Tuscan woman who spoke no English, but communicated through the universal language of food and enthusiastic gestures. Each day brought new discoveries, not just of Italy, but of myself. I rediscovered passions that had been set aside during decades of family obligations. I made friends with locals and fellow travelers, engaging in conversations that had nothing to do with being Richard's mother or the keeper of a historic home. My communication with home was sparse but telling. Richard called weekly, his initial conversations focused on household logistics. "Where do you keep the insurance documents? The dishwasher is making a strange noise," before gradually shifting to more personal matters. I never knew you studied in Florence for a semester, he said during one call. I found your old sketchbooks in the library. There's a lot you don't know about me, I replied, not unkindly. I had a whole life before I became your mother. A pause. I'm starting to realize that. From Zoe, I received regular updates that painted a picture of a household in transition. Eleanor had thrown herself into redecorating the East Wing, only to be stymied by contractors who refused to make structural changes without the owner's explicit approval. She'd hosted a dinner party that had ended in near disaster when the ancient plumbing system backed up, something I could have prevented with my knowledge of the house's quirks. Mr. Williams fixed it himself, Zoe reported. He found your home, maintenance journal in your study, and followed your instructions. He seemed pretty proud of himself. Richard? Fixing something in the house? The same Richard who had always called contractors for the smallest repair? It was a small shift, but a meaningful one. By the time I reached Venice in my 3rd month, I felt transformed, not into someone new, but into a more authentic version of myself. My hair, which I'd kept conservatively styled for years, now fell, in natural waves that several people had complimented. My wardrobe had evolved from practical New England classics to include colorful Italian pieces that expressed my rediscovered sense of style. I was sitting at a cafe overlooking the Grand Canal, sketching the intricate facade of a palazzo across the water, when my phone rang. Eleanor's name flashed on the screen. The first time she had called directly since my departure. Victoria. Her voice sounded strained. When are you coming home? No greeting, no questions about my travels. Just the demand, thinly disguised, as a question. Hello, Eleanor. Venice is beautiful this time of year. You and Richard should visit someday. A frustrated sigh. We don't have time for vacations right now. The house is... There are issues. I set down my pencil. What kind of issues? The Historical Society is doing some kind of review. They sent an official letter about potential modifications to the property. Something about preservation guidelines and permits. I suppressed a smile. Jonathan Hargrove, the silver-haired man from the dinner party, had mentioned the Historical Society's increasing scrutiny of landmark properties. It seemed the Williams estate had come under their radar. I see. And what modifications are they concerned about? How should I know? Eleanor snapped, then caught herself. I mean, I'm not familiar with all the work that's been done over the years. Richard tried to explain it to them, but they want to speak with the owner. That would be me, I said mildly. Another sigh, this one heavier. Yes, I know. That's why I'm calling. Can you just email them or something? Tell them everything is fine? I don't think it works that way, Eleanor. Historical preservation is a complex field with strict regulations. But you understand all that, right? You could handle it? I gazed across the canal, watching gondolas glide by in the golden afternoon light. I could, but I'm currently enjoying Venice. A long silence followed. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming the carefully modulated tone she used when trying to get her way. Victoria, I understand you needed this break, but we really need your expertise now. The family needs you. Family, the word she'd used so dismissively at the dinner party, now deployed as a tool of obligation. I'll be home when my trip is complete, I said firmly. As planned. But, Eleanor, I interrupted. I've spent decades preserving that house. A few more weeks won't make a difference. If the Historical Society has concerns, they can wait until I return. Or you and Richard can learn about the property you've been claiming as your own. I could almost hear her teeth grinding through the phone. Fine. When exactly will you be back? 3 weeks from Thursday. I've already sent Richard my flight details. 3 weeks? But the Historical Society wants to schedule a walkthrough next week. Then you'll need to reschedule, won't you? I kept my voice pleasant but firm. Give them my contact information. Tell them I'm in Italy researching historical preservation techniques if you'd like. It's even partially true. This is ridiculous, Eleanor muttered. It's just a house. No, Eleanor. It's my house, my home, my legacy. Something you've never truly understood or respected. I took a breath, softening my tone. When I return, we'll need to have a serious conversation about the future arrangements. All of us. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've had time to think, and I've made some decisions. But those can wait until I'm home. What decisions? Victoria, if this is about that stupid dinner party, it's about much more than one dinner party. But this isn't a conversation we should have over the phone. I'll see you in 3 weeks. I ended the call before she could protest further, returning my attention to my sketch. But my peaceful afternoon had been disrupted, my thoughts now turning toward home and the confrontation that awaited me there. That evening, I met Margaret and Catherine for dinner at a small restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of Venice. We'd kept in touch throughout our travels, and they were both nearing the end of their Italian sojourns as well. My daughter-in-law called today, I told them over plates of seafood risotto. There's an issue with the Historical Society, and suddenly my expertise is invaluable, Margaret chuckled. Of course. Now that they need something, you're no longer just the help. What did you tell her? Catherine asked, refilling our wine glasses. That I'd be home as scheduled. Not a day sooner. They both nodded approvingly. And when you get back? Margaret prompted. I twirled my fork in the creamy rice, considering. I've decided to reclaim my home completely. Not just my role in it, but the physical space itself. You're asking them to move out? Catherine raised an eyebrow. I'm giving them options, I clarified. They can stay, but with clear boundaries and expectations. Or they can find their own place, with my help if they need it. But the current arrangement is over. They won't like that, Margaret observed. Probably not, but it's not about what they like anymore. It's about what I need. We raised our glasses in another toast, to boundaries and new beginnings. But as we continued our meal, I couldn't help wondering how Richard and Eleanor would respond to the changes I was bringing home with me. Changes far more profound than my new hairstyle or Italian wardrobe. 3 weeks later, as my plane began its descent into Boston, I felt a curious mixture of emotions, anticipation, resolve, and yes, a touch of nervousness. Italy had been a sanctuary, a place of rediscovery. Now I was returning to face the life I had left behind, armed with a new perspective and firm intentions. As the wheels touched down on American soil, I made myself a promise. I would never again allow myself to be erased, not even by those I loved most. The Victoria Williams returning home was not the same woman who had left 3 months ago, and that, I knew, would change everything. Richard was waiting for me at the airport, his face breaking into a genuine smile when he spotted me coming through the arrivals gate. He looked different somehow, more tired but also more substantial, as if he had aged in small but meaningful ways during my absence. Mom! He embraced me warmly, then stepped back, really looking at me. You look amazing. Different. Italy agrees with me, I said simply. As he collected my luggage, I noticed small changes in his demeanor, a new confidence in his movements, a directness in his gaze that had previously been missing. I've been handling the house maintenance. Myself, he volunteered as we walked to his car. Found your logbooks in the study. Pretty impressive system you've got. Years of experience, I replied. How is everything? Really? He hesitated, loading my suitcases into the trunk. Challenging. The Historical Society has been persistent, and Eleanor's been stressed about work. The London position didn't come through. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? He glanced at me, then looked away. Anyway, she's been staying at her parents' place for the past week. Said she needed space to think. This was unexpected. Space. From what? Richard sighed as he slid into the driver's seat. From me? From the house. From everything. We've been reassessing things. The drive home was filled with Richard's careful updates about the house, the neighborhood, his work. Nothing too personal, nothing too revealing. I let him talk, noting what he chose to share and what remained unsaid. When we turned onto the long driveway of the Williams estate, I felt a surge of emotion at the sight of my home. The maples were ablaze with autumn color, the gardens meticulously maintained despite my absence. Zoe's been amazing, Richard said, following my gaze. She kept everything running just the way you would have. We pulled up to the front entrance, and I paused before getting out of the car, taking in the familiar facade. 3 months had given me perspective. This wasn't just a house, but the physical embodiment of my life's work and family legacy. Inside, everything looked the same, yet somehow different, like a familiar painting viewed from a new angle. The entry hall was immaculate, fresh flowers arranged in the crystal vase on the console table. Something I always did upon returning from trips. Zoe, I guessed. Richard nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. She said you'd want flowers when you came home. I moved through the room slowly, reacquainting myself with my home. In the library, I noticed my architectural books had been rearranged, some placed on the desk with bookmarks. I've been reading about historical preservation, Richard admitted when he saw me notice. Trying to understand what you've devoted your life to. In that simple statement was the acknowledgement I had longed for, recognition of my professional identity, not just my maternal one. The Historical Society representatives are coming tomorrow, he continued. I told them you'd just returned, but they're eager to meet with you. Something about ensuring the renovations meet preservation standards. I nodded, running my hand along the back of a chair, one that had been in my family for generations. I'll be ready for them. Mom, Richard said, his voice suddenly serious. We need to talk about what happens next. With the house, with Eleanor, and me. With everything. I met his gaze steadily. Yes, we do. But not tonight. Tonight I'm home. And that's enough for now. That evening, I reacquainted myself with the rhythms of my home. I walked through the gardens at dusk, the familiar scent of autumn roses welcoming me back. I prepared a simple dinner in my kitchen, realizing how much I had missed the gleaming copper pots hanging above the center island, the smooth marble countertops that had witnessed decades of family meals. Richard joined me, helping in small ways, setting the table, opening wine, with a new attentiveness. We ate on the terrace, watching darkness settle over the grounds, our conversation flowing more easily than it had in years. Italy changed you, he observed, studying me across the candlelit table. Not changed, I corrected. Reminded. Of who? I was before I became defined solely as your mother or the keeper of this house. He nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that night, the dinner party. How I just stood there while Eleanor. He trailed off, struggling with the admission. While she erased me, I finished for him. Yes. He looked down at his plate. I've let that happen for years, haven't I? Not just Eleanor. I've done it too. Taken you for granted. Assumed you existed to support my life rather than living your own. The acknowledgement, so long awaited, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I blinked them away, unwilling to diminish this moment with easy emotion. Why did you never say anything? He asked quietly. I thought that's what mothers did. Sacrifice, fade into the background so their children could shine. I sipped my wine thoughtfully. It took a complete stranger calling me the help in my own home to make me realize how fully I'd disappeared. Morning brought the Historical Society representatives, Jonathan Hargrove and 2 preservation specialists. I greeted them in the library, dressed in a tailored Italian suit that reflected my reclaimed professional identity. Mrs. Williams, Jonathan said warmly, What a pleasure to see you again. I understand you've been researching preservation techniques in Italy? I smiled at the explanation Eleanor had apparently given for my absence. Among other things, Italy offers rather comprehensive lessons in architectural history. The meeting was productive and surprisingly enjoyable. The concerns that had so worried Eleanor were minor: questions about modifications to the East Wing, documentation for the updated electrical systems, verification that the replacement windows met historical standards. All meticulously documented, I assured them, retrieving the relevant files from my study. I've maintained complete records of every renovation, including material sources, contractor certifications, and compliance verification. Jonathan looked impressed. Your thoroughness is remarkable. If only all historical property owners were so diligent. This isn't just a house to me, I explained. It's my heritage and my life's work. After they departed, promising to send formal approval documentation, I found Richard waiting in the morning room, tension evident in his posture. That went well, I observed. You made it look easy, he said. Eleanor was convinced they were going to demand major changes or fine us or something. Eleanor doesn't understand the difference between renovation and restoration. I sat across from him, folding my hands in my lap. Which brings us to the conversation we need to have. Richard straightened, bracing himself. About our living situation. Yes, I've had time to think, and I've made some decisions. Before you say anything, he interjected, you should know that Eleanor and I have been talking about moving out, finding our own place. This surprised me. That's quite a change from before I left. He smiled ruefully. A lot has changed in 3 months. Without you here, we had to face realities we'd been avoiding. The house needs constant attention that neither of us knows how to provide. And more importantly, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. We needed to acknowledge that this is your home, not ours. We've been guests who overstayed our welcome and forgot our manners. The simple recognition felt like the first rain after a long drought. Refreshing, necessary, life-giving. I appreciate that acknowledgement, I said carefully. It means more than you might realize. But I'm not forcing you out, Richard. This house has always been meant for family. He nodded, looking around the morning room with its pale yellow walls and French doors opening to the garden, a space I had redesigned when he was a child to catch the best light for reading. I know. But Eleanor and I need to build something that's truly ours. We've been living in your shadow, or rather hiding in it, taking advantage of your expertise, your generosity, without developing our own skills or independence. There was a maturity in his assessment that touched me deeply. My son had done some growing up during my absence. We've found a place, he continued. A brownstone in the city that needs some work but has good bones. Actually, I was hoping you might consult on the renovation. As an architect, not as my mother who'll fix everything for us. I smiled at the distinction. I'd be honored. As a consultant. A comfortable silence settled between us, the kind we hadn't shared in years. Outside, the gardener was trimming the hedges, the rhythmic snip-snip a familiar backdrop to a moment of genuine connection. And Eleanor? I finally asked. Where does she stand in all this? Richard's expression grew more complex. She's adjusting. Realizing some things about herself, about us, about her ambitions. The London position falling through hit her hard, made her question what she's been chasing and why. And your marriage? He looked down at his hands. We're working on it. The past 3 months revealed some fault lines we'd been ignoring. But we're talking now. Really talking. Not just coordinating schedules or discussing career moves. I reached across and squeezed his hand briefly. I'm glad to hear that. What about you, Mom? What happens next for you? It was the question I'd been contemplating throughout my travels. What did I want for this next chapter of my life? I'm reopening my consulting business, I said decisively. Williams Architectural Restoration. I've already had inquiries from some connections I made in Italy, and Jonathan mentioned 2 projects the Historical Society is overseeing. Richard looked pleased but not surprised. You're the best in the field. They'd be lucky to have you. And I'm reclaiming this house completely. Not just as the owner, but as someone who lives fully in every room. No more confining myself to certain spaces or adapting my routines around others' preferences. As it should be, he agreed. I'm also thinking of hosting architectural students for workshops. This property has educational value that should be shared. He nodded, then hesitated before asking, And what about us? Will we still be welcome here? The question revealed his deeper concern, that my reclamation might mean exclusion, that boundaries might become barriers. Richard, I said gently, this will always be your family home. You and Eleanor will always be welcome here, as visitors who respect this space and the person who created it, not as entitled residents who expect service, but as family who understand the difference between being accommodated and being catered to. Relief crossed his features. That sounds fair. More than fair. And I expect the same respect when I visit your new home, I added with a small smile. No relegating me to kitchen duty during dinner parties. He winced at the reference but nodded firmly. Never again. The doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. Through the window, I spotted Eleanor's car in the driveway. Richard and I exchanged a look, both knowing this next conversation would test our newly established understanding. Ready? He asked. I straightened my shoulders. Absolutely. Eleanor entered with a tentative air that contrasted sharply with her usual confident stride. She was impeccably dressed as always, but there was something different in her demeanor, a watchfulness, a caution that hadn't been there before. Victoria, she said, nodding in greeting. Welcome back. Italy seems to have agreed with you. Thank you, Eleanor? It was transformative in many ways. An awkward silence fell as she took in the changes in me, not just the new hairstyle and clothes, but the subtle shift in how I carried myself, how I claimed space in my own home. Richard cleared his throat. I was just telling Mom about the brownstone we're considering. Eleanor's eyes darted between us. Yes, it's a beautiful property. Needs work, but has potential. Richard mentioned you might want my professional opinion on the renovation. I said, We'd value your expertise, she replied carefully. As a consultant, of course. The qualification, a recognition of my professional status rather than just familial obligation, was significant. Whether it reflected genuine growth or merely strategic adaptation remained to be seen. I hear the London position didn't work out, I said, gently steering the conversation to what I suspected was a sore point. Eleanor's composure flickered briefly. No, they went with an internal candidate. Politics, mainly. I'm sorry. I know. How much it meant to you. She looked surprised at my genuine sympathy. Thank you. It's been clarifying, actually. Made me reassess some priorities. Richard moved to stand beside her, a subtle show of support. We both have. I gestured toward the garden. Shall we continue this conversation on the terrace? It's a beautiful day. They followed me outside, where the autumn sun bathed the gardens in golden light. We sat at the wrought iron table where our family had shared countless meals over the years. I won't pretend the past few months have been easy, Eleanor began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When you left, everything fell apart surprisingly quickly. The house, our routines. Our assumptions, Richard added quietly. Eleanor nodded. Yes, we realized how much we'd taken for granted. Not just your help with maintaining the house, but your knowledge, your presence, everything. I listened without interrupting, noting the careful choice of words, the measured tone. This was Eleanor at her most diplomatic, approaching a negotiation she needed to win. The dinner party was inexcusable, she continued. I was thoughtless and disrespectful, introducing you that way in your own home. She shook her head. I could offer explanations about pressure and ambition, but they'd just be excuses. I appreciate your acknowledgement, I said simply. Eleanor seemed thrown by my calm acceptance, perhaps expecting either emotional absolution or continued conflict. She rallied quickly. Moving forward, we thought it best to find our own place. Give you back your home, give ourselves a fresh start. Richard mentioned that. I think it's a wise decision. She relaxed slightly, clearly relieved that I wasn't going to fight their departure. Had she expected me to beg them to stay? To maintain the arrangement that had so thoroughly diminished me? I've been doing some thinking too, I said, about what I want for the next chapter of my life. Reopening my consulting business, using this house as it was meant to be used, as a home that reflects my passions and interests, not just a backdrop for others' lives. Eleanor nodded rapidly. Of course. You deserve that. It's not about what I deserve, Eleanor. It's about what I choose. I looked between her and Richard. We all got caught in roles that became confining. Me as the supportive mother who existed to serve, you as the ambitious daughter-in-law determined to claim her territory, Richard as the son trying to keep peace between two strong women. Richard looked down, acknowledging the truth of my assessment. But those roles were never the whole truth of who we are, I continued. And they certainly don't have to define our future relationship. Eleanor studied me, seeming to truly see me for the first time. What kind of relationship do you envision going forward? It was a fair question, asked with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than calculation. One based on mutual respect and clearer boundaries, I replied. You and Richard will build your lives in your new home, and I'll reclaim mine here. We'll visit each other as family does, with advance notice, with consideration, with the understanding that we're guests in each other's spaces. And holidays? Richard asked. Family traditions? We'll create new ones that work for all of us, I said. Perhaps hosting duties can rotate. I imagine your brownstone will be lovely for Christmas once you've renovated it. The suggestion, that I might be a guest in their home rather than always the host in mine, seemed to startle them both. I'd like that, Eleanor said, with what seemed like sincere warmth. A fresh start for all of us. I nodded, then added the caveat that needed to be stated clearly. But for this to work, Eleanor, you'll need to see me, really see me, as more than just Richard's mother or the previous lady of the house. I have a name, a profession, an identity, separate from my relationship to both of you. Color rose in her cheeks, but she held my gaze. I understand. I've had a lot of time to reflect on how I've behaved, the assumptions I made. Working with the Historical Society without you here was illuminating. They spoke of you with such respect as a leading expert in your field. It made me realize how little I've bothered to learn about who you really are. It was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever said to me. Then perhaps that's where we start, I suggested. Getting to know each other as we are now, not as the roles we've been playing. The tension that had hung over us began to dissipate, replaced by something tentative but hopeful. When will you move? I asked, shifting to practical matters. We've made an offer on the brownstone, Richard said. If all goes well, within a month? I'll help however I can, I offered. And when you're ready, I'd be happy to consult on the renovation, professionally with proper boundaries. Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I'd value that. Your expertise, I mean. Not just your labor. It was a small acknowledgement, but a meaningful one. The woman who had once dismissed me as just the cleaning lady was beginning to recognize my true value. To new beginnings, Richard said, raising his water glass in an impromptu toast. Eleanor and I joined him. our glasses meeting with a gentle chime that sounded remarkably like possibility. 6 months later, I stood in the foyer of Richard and Eleanor's newly renovated brownstone, admiring the careful blend of historic preservation and modern functionality that we had achieved together. The restoration had become an unexpected bridge between Eleanor and me, a project where my expertise was not only acknowledged but actively sought, where we could relate as professionals rather than just in-laws. The original moldings came out beautifully, I noted, running my finger along the intricate woodwork we had painstakingly restored. Your contractor did an excellent job following the specifications. He said you were the most thorough consultant he'd ever worked with, Eleanor replied with a smile that held a new respect. Called you a national treasure of architectural knowledge. It was a small moment, but significant. Eleanor sharing another's praise of me rather than claiming credit or diminishing my contribution. The past months had brought gradual but meaningful shifts in our family dynamic. Richard and Eleanor had moved out of my home with surprisingly little drama, taking only what was truly theirs and asking permission before removing anything of uncertain ownership. I had helped them select period-appropriate fixtures for their new home, while they had respected my decisions about reclaiming my spaces at the Williams estate. My consulting business had flourished, with several significant restoration projects keeping me engaged and fulfilled. I'd begun hosting monthly architectural workshops in my home, sharing my knowledge with students and fellow professionals. The East Wing, once Richard and Eleanor's domain, had been transformed into a comfortable guest suite where they occasionally stayed when visiting, always with advance notice, always as welcome guests rather than entitled residents. Tonight was a milestone, their first formal dinner party in their new home, with me invited as a guest of honor rather than unpaid help. The dining room table was set beautifully, with Eleanor's own style evident in every carefully chosen detail. Victoria, would you like to see what we've done with the library? Eleanor asked, leading me toward what had been the brownstone's most challenging space. We incorporated your suggestion about the built-in bookshelves, but added our own touch with the lighting. I followed her into a warm, inviting room where original architectural elements had been preserved while contemporary comforts had been thoughtfully integrated. It was unmistakably their space, reflecting both their tastes, yet I could see where my influence had helped shape certain decisions. It's wonderful, I said sincerely. You've created something truly special here. Eleanor hesitated, then said quietly, We couldn't have done it without you. Not just your expertise, but your forgiveness, your willingness to try again with us. The doorbell rang before I could respond, announcing the arrival of their other dinner guests. As Eleanor went to answer it, Richard appeared at my side. Happy? He asked simply. I considered the question, thinking of my reclaimed home, my revitalized career, and this new, healthier relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. Yes, I said. I am. Richard squeezed my hand. Me too. And you know what the best part is? Tonight, you get to just enjoy the dinner. No cooking, no serving, no cleaning up. Just a guest? I teased. He shook his head. No, Mom. Never just anything. The guest of honor. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.